Welcome to the unSeminary podcast. Are you looking for practical ministry help to drive your ministry further, faster? Have a sinking feeling that your ministry training didn't prepare you for the real world? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others in pursuit of stuff that we wish they had taught in seminary. Buckle up and let's get started with this week's unSeminary podcast.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to the unSeminary podcast. My name's Rich, the host around these parts. I am so glad that you've decided to spend some time with us. I know that you've got a lot going on, and we're honored that you would take some time out to spend with us today. I think you're going to love today's conversation because we're talking with the donkey, Lane Sebring. Welcome to the show, Lane.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Lane's a great leader. I really hope if you're listening in today that you'll get a chance to plug in with what he's got going on. He's got a great name for his site, preachingdonkey.com, really talking to communicators, people who are passionate about communicating the message of Jesus. And I think Lane, he's one of these guys you should be following and paying attention to. He's got some great, practical help. In a lot of ways, I feel like, Preaching Donkey, there's a great resonance with some of what we're doing at unSeminary. Obviously not the same, but similar, just trying to help other church leaders out. So Lane, I'm just glad that you're here today. Why did you start Preaching Donkey? Tell me about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for having me on the show. Really love your podcast. I love Preaching Donkey is a fan of all things unSeminary. We just love you guys. And everything you put out is just really helpful to the church community. So thank you for that. Thanks for having me on the show. Preaching Donkey started as this idea. When I was in college, my undergraduate degree, I did communications and learned kind of the basic principles of what it takes to connect with human beings. And then I went to seminary and I learned how to bore everyone with the Bible. And if you're a seminarian, I don't mean that as an insult. I'm just saying I just saw coming out of seminary there was so much emphasis on what is important, absolutely, biblical exegesis and accurately walking people through a text and having a basic accurate sermon. But I started to realize that there wasn't that much of an emphasis on how to clearly communicate those ideas. And I just started to write these ideas down and write these things down that I thought this might be helpful to look at this from a different angle. And I'm not the first one to ever do this, but I just started blogging and just started podcasting, and we've got some people who are connecting with our material. And so kind of started from that idea of most pastors, when they finish the message, they ask the question, did I say all of the words that I needed to say? Right. Which is not a good question to ask. The better question to ask is, did they hear what they needed to hear so that they can do something with it? And so communication is the primary principle that kind of fuels Preaching Donkey.
Oh, I love it. Why is it called Preaching Donkey?
Okay, so in Numbers 22, there's a story very familiar, if you know kind of the Old Testament narratives, of a donkey named Balaam, who God spoke through this donkey, Balaam was the man, but his donkey spoke to him, and God used this donkey to communicate a message. And so we just say at Preaching Donkey, if God can speak through a donkey, he can speak through us. And we find a lot of encouragement in that. And we don't take ourselves too seriously because God used a donkey one time, and he may go back to doing that, but right now he uses people. So
when I was a kid, Balaam's donkey story was one of those that you'd look up because in the King James it said Balaam's ass, which was just a great, and when you're like a junior high kid, that's the kind of stuff. That and Song of Solomon is just great stuff to look up. So,
we used to sit in church and just find those verses and give them to each other and
look at that.
Pass the time.
That's fantastic. When I was in school, preaching class I was in, it was like a radical idea at the time. I don't think it's a radical idea today, but at the time, our preaching prof would roll out David Letterman, video VHS tapes that we'd watch, and at the time that was such a radical idea. Like, oh my goodness, we have to look at how people in the culture are communicating. Let's kind of unpack that a little bit. What would you say, are some of those ways that maybe the traditional seminary approach to, sermon, preparation and, presentation maybe isn't covering it, isn't doing what it needs to do? What are some of those things that you've had in your system or you're encouraging your system really for communicators?
Well, I think part of it has to do with the communicator is always thinking about the listener, whereas the preacher tends to think about the text first, the text second, the text last. And really, the text does come first. The text is primary. We need to be preaching the word. And some people have confused Preaching Donkey and our message for being not that. And we are so far away from saying that you shouldn't preach the word. We're all about preaching the word, and we actually think preaching the word is so important that it needs to get across. So communication and preparation of the sermon begins with the idea of who am I talking to? If I'm speaking to a group of people and I know them and they know me and I can connect with them on this level, then I know what would apply to them. I know what would connect with them. I know what they care about, what they don't care about. So beginning to think about the listener. And I think also preparation typically what you've found kind of traditionally is the pastor would go into a room like Moses walking up to a mountain, right? And he would go into a room and he would sit in there for 20 hours. And a lot of pastors would pride themselves on, it takes me 30 hours a week to prepare. Just me in a room with my books and my Bible and my brain and my God. And then I come out and I say, thus saith the Lord.
Right.
And what happens if you do that week after week, year after year, for decades on end, you really start to draw from a dry well. It's just you and your thoughts, and sure, you're reading things, but you are constantly just giving out of the same thing. And so we encourage a preparation method that's team driven. If you think about everything we do in churches, especially these days, it's all team driven. If you're not working in teams, you're not doing what you should be doing, equipping people and working in teams. So the preparation process for the sermon actually begins with a team of people that are looking at the same content, the text, looking at the message series, if you teach the series, which obviously we recommend that, and then looking at what is the objective and desired response for this sermon and for the series as a whole. So what is an objective? How do we define that? Objective for a sermon is, what do we want the sermon to do? So if I'm preaching a message and I don't know what I want my sermon to do, then it's really confusing for me when I go to prepare. So I want to know what the sermon is supposed to do. The desired response is, what are people supposed to do with the sermon, right? And so I need to know very clearly what the sermon does and what people do with it. And so those two things, I feel like when you're contrasting it with a more traditional approach, a lot of times the thinking about the end and the listener is really kind of an afterthought, and we just say push it to the forefront.
Very cool. One thing I've noticed as you deal with, I've had the privilege over the years of interacting with some very large churches that have had great impact, and one of the interesting things, there is that notion of like the lone pastor that goes up onto the hill. But actually the pattern I've seen pretty consistently in large kind of name brand churches is preaching is a team sport. They have a group of people around them that are helping with the content. Some of that's staff, some of that's volunteers, but it's not, although at the end of the day, they're the one that's going to stand up and actually deliver the message. There's typically a group of people around them. On that, what are you seeing work? Let's say it's, maybe a smaller church, a few hundred people. How can they kind of get more people involved in the preparation process, even on the front end, to get people, plugged in on the team side?
That's a great question, yeah, because that comes a lot when we talk about this and write about it. People will say, sure, that's great if you've got a staff of 100 people. Right. You can pull anybody you want. What do you do if you have a church of 100 people? What I say is begin, and I outline it kind of a method in the book that's going to come out, or that came out May 3rd, about how to build a team informally. Because when we think about a preaching team, it's this big, heavy, okay, does that mean we have to meet? Like our preaching team meets every Monday. We meet at 2:00, and it's a set amount of people. Not every team needs to look like that. It could be an informal group of people that you have reached out to and invited them into the mysterious world of sermon preparation, where maybe just at some point during the week you bounce your ideas around with them over coffee, or you do it over email. Yeah. I think most pastors would be surprised to find out how many people in their church are actually very intrigued by the content that's created. And when you start to invite people into that, a lot of times what you'll find is people will say, yeah, I have ideas. And it's important to reach out to the right people. And it's important to reach out to people that are thoughtful and that have the same vision that you do and support the church. But when you find those people, it doesn't always have to be a meeting in person once a week.
That's a good flag, yep. For sure. Yeah, and even passing ideas around on email, or like, hey, I'm thinking about doing a thing in the summertime on the book of John, but I'm kind of stuck on it. This is what I'm wrestling with. What do you think? And finding that group of people, whether it's like you say, formal or informal. On the delivery side, people, there was a time when, compelling communication was standing behind a very large wood lectern and screaming at the top of your lung. That's changed. What are you seeing on that front from a preaching donkey point of view? What are you seeing on the delivery point of view that's maybe people need to be thinking about?
I think one of the recent interviews that you did, I think back in April, where you had a guy talking about teams, and he was mentioning just even your volunteer teams, they're not thinking about church until 9 a.m. Sunday morning, right? You're thinking about it 7 days, right? You're thinking about it 7 days a week. They think about it at 9 a.m. and they've got to be there at 9:15. Yep. And they're volunteers. They're the ones who are actually in the trenches doing ministry. So if you think about the entire congregation on a Sunday morning or a Saturday night or whenever you meet, most people are walking in there and they are thinking about anything and everything other than your sermon. And where most pastors get it wrong is because they're so excited, we spend a whole week or 2 or 3 for Andy Stanley or 3 weeks ahead, so he's been thinking about his message for 3 weeks. Yep. We spend all this time thinking about this material that's about to just burst out of us. And we have to really think, are the people there yet? And the reality is some are, most aren't. So it's really your job to create interest. And so with a little bit of knowledge of how people receive information and make decisions, I think a preacher can really affect the hearts and minds of the listener. One of the principles that we outline in the book is getting people to care before they know. Getting people to care before they know. A lot of pastors come out with the knowledge, right? That's where we get the old adage, 3 points in a poem. Make the points, give a poem, and then the points are supposed to be the information that they, oh, yes, that's true. And then the poem is supposed to be the thing that really moves their heart, and then you go on from there. The problem with that method, and that's kind of an old way of doing it, not wrong or right, it's just one of the methods. But Aristotle's theory of communication suggests that there are basically 3 ways that people connect with a message. There needs to be ethos, pathos, and logos. So ethos is the credibility of the speaker. So they have to trust you. They have to know that you are that you have a trustworthy message. And then pathos, you have to move them on an emotional level. And then logos or logos, it has to make sense logically, and it has to be something that connects with their mind. So a lot of times pastors have the ethos because maybe it's their church and they know them. So then it's down to pathos and logos, but a lot of pastors will hit the logos really hard. Here are the points. Here are the facts. Here's the propositional truths. Here's the text.
Here's the sticky statement.
Right, and then at the end of it, they say, okay, how can we get people to care about this? And that's inverted. Darlene Price wrote a great book called Well Said, and she outlines how basically the way humans make decisions, and psychology and a lot of research backs this up, is most people make decisions on emotions first, and then they have the facts. They get the facts later. So for example, if you go to a car dealership, the car dealer is not going to walk up to you and say, hey, the payments on this are $399 a month over 72 months and you can do it because the interest rate's really low. He's not going to get there. Right. What he's going to do is he's going to say, you would look great in that car, wouldn't you?
Right.
That car would look great on you. You would make the road shine with that car. Can you imagine? And then once you're emotionally connected, yeah, sure, then we're going to sit down and talk about financing. But right now, I need to get you emotionally invested in this car. So as a communicator, you have to, Andy Stanley calls it building tension in his kind of gold standard book, Communicating for a Change. He talks about it as building tension. You have to get people to care before they're interested in knowing what you have to say.
Very cool. Very cool. As we continue on, the back end, after a message happens, what are church leaders doing to ensure that it's actually making an impact? A part of what I love that you're pushing us here to think through is, let's start with, is it making an impact on our people? What are church leaders doing, or what should we be doing, to kind of gain feedback about our messages?
Right. So like anything else, you just have to get honest and regular and consistent feedback. And I think this is especially difficult for a lot of senior pastors because most people around you work for you. And if you don't really set up a culture where they know that you are okay receiving feedback, even if it's a critique, then you're just never going to hear it. And the feedback you get from your congregation can be helpful, but a lot of times what we talk about at Preaching Donkey is positive feedback is usually very general. Hey, great sermon. Means nothing, kind of encouraging, but doesn't really help you. Negative feedback is usually pretty specific. Your sermon was so awful, I wanted to die. All right? And so, or what you said here was so bad, I cringed and I hated you for it. And so not helpful either and kind of discouraging. So there's something in the middle where to get honest and reliable feedback, this is where your preaching team comes into play. At our preaching team meetings, we do a fair amount of evaluation of the previous week's sermon. We seek feedback in every possible way. One of the things I teach pastors to do is if someone comes up to you after a sermon, and it's not going to be awkward, and they say, hey, your sermon really touched me. Most pastors say, oh, thank you.
Thank you.
It was God. It was God. And then they move on,
Right.
and they never ask why. And it's so helpful in that moment where someone has really been moved by your sermon. If it's not going to be uncomfortable, just say, can you just tell me what about it? What was helpful? And a lot of times people will share, well, when you said this, it just impacted me in this way. And if you get enough of those conversations, you start to realize what works and what doesn't. And then the same is true if somebody walks up and says, your sermon, I just felt like it was bad or whatever. Okay, well, help me understand what made that negative impact on you. And so anyway, consistent feedback is really helpful.
No, absolutely. In our church, we have a thing we call Thursday Night Gospel Hour. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek name because it's never just an hour. But what we do is whoever's preaching this weekend, and this is led by our lead guy, Tim Lucas, great preacher, great communicator. Every week he preaches the entire message for a small group of us. So there's a kind of a consistent core. There's our secondary communicator. There's myself. There's at least one person from our kind of creative graphics design, department, and then it may rotate. Other people may come through. He full on preaches it. So it's not like he preaches it as if there's 1,000 people in the room. So he delivers it as is. We do a lot of props. He does a lot of he's using stuff on stage. So part of it is he wants to make sure, that all works out just even physically. But the amazing thing about it, and he's an accomplished communicator, is we then literally go page by page. He preaches from a manuscript. We literally, after it, give kind of overall feedback and then go page by page on, and some of it's big stuff. Like this happened a couple weeks ago where it was like, Tim, you're preaching 2 different messages here. You've got this whole thing and that whole thing. You need to get rid of one of them. Pick one or the other. You don't need to do both. Or some of it is literally just like, when you said that makes you sound really old, or like you keep using 90s TV references. Seinfeld's been off the air for 20 years. Stop talking about Seinfeld. And the amazing thing, as a person who gets the privilege of giving that feedback, I'm always like, man, that says a lot that he's open to that kind of feedback.
It does.
That he's willing to take that. But you know what? I see it. It makes him a better communicator. And as a person who's been on the receiving end of that, when I've preached and had that feedback, it's invaluable because you get inside your message and you can't get any perspective on it.
That's one of the coolest ideas I've heard in a long time. I love that. I think that's fantastic. The Thursday night pre-sermon. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
When's your first? Do you guys do Saturday night?
So Sunday morning, we don't at this point don't do any Saturday night. Okay. And he would say, because I don't know anyone that does it as robust as us. We bump into other church leaders where they talk about like after their first service, they have a group of people that'll come in the green room and talk through it.
Yep.
And I'm always like, why wait until then? Like, why wait till you've just punished your first service? Why not do it, ahead of time of that? Now, I think, again, a big part of that the point, I was trying to make is to open up, senior leaders and communicators be open to that feedback, and open to that evaluation, is important, as you look, to the future in your communication.
And I think in your situation, he probably led the way in that, and
Absolutely.
That's really important. Senior pastors need to really take a step and lead the way.
Yeah, absolutely. The only reason why we do it is because he set it up. Now, what has happened? The interesting thing has happened is over the years, because we use that for every time a campus pastor speaks. If we do if a youth guy gets up and speak, they all go through it. We now have an approach, a system of preaching. Like we have benchmarks for what we're trying to accomplish through it, and that's because he's had to articulate it over the years. But it's now replicatable. It's now able to kind of say, hey, this is when you do a message at our church, this is what it's going to look like. I'm talking too much.
No, that I love that because the consistency. I mean, one of the things we talk about at Preaching Donkey a lot is having a schedule. And I know benchmarks for what you want to accomplish is a little bit different. But if you know on Monday what has to be done and on Tuesday what has to be done.
Right.
And the rehearsal, so Thursday night you guys do the rehearsal. I rehearse my sermons on Thursday afternoon. I do it to an empty room and you got my head spinning because I really should do it to a full room or to at least 5 or 6 people. But I want to say one thing really quick if we have time about rehearsing. Yeah. Your worship leader, okay, and your worship team is going to rehearse the same song 57 times,
Very
right?
Good point.
A song that someone else wrote and they've done 5 times already. They're going to and they're going to replicate that process week after week after week. Why? When they get up, they want to know exactly what to expect. They want to be able to deliver that song dynamically and impactfully. Pastors, what'll happen is they'll say, well, I've been preaching for a long time, I know what I'm doing, and they write it and they just get up and they go. And I want to know exactly what to expect, and I want to hear myself say it, because a lot of times I'll go, that is not what I intended for it to sound like. Or transitions. A lot of things get lost in transition from A to B. There's non sequiturs, and you can clean a lot of that up in rehearsal. So I recommend to everyone, even if you can't set up a team like that yet, get in an empty room, as awkward as it is, take your notes, take your PowerPoint, whatever you use, and preach as if there's 1,000 people in the room.
Absolutely. No, that's good. And I think, obviously a few months ago, there was that, gaffe that Andy Stanley had, where he was, making fun of small churches and all that, which I'm like, P.S. I've never said this on the show. I'm like, P.S. people, give him a break. Like, come on. He's a huge supporter of all kinds of churches and has one misstep in a message and people jump all over him. But but it's interesting. The way I chalked that up to was, there's a guy who, he doesn't do the kind of rehearsal thing. He's speaking from points, gets up there, and your mind gets going and things come out of your mouth. Right. And, when you're Andy Stanley, who none of us are as gifted as he is, you can get away with it, but none of us are that. Before we kind of move on with the rest of the episode, anything else you want to share?
Well, I just want to share with your listeners, if I could. I've got a book coming that came out May 3rd.
Yes.
This is called Preaching Killer Sermons, How to Create and Deliver Messages That Captivate and Inspire. And so a lot of the principles that we outlined in the show today are laid out in that book. You can also find us at Preaching Donkey on Twitter, on Facebook, Preaching Donkey, and preachingdonkey.com. And I also just want to say, one of the things that happens when you start talking about preaching is people say, well, is that the only thing there is? Do you think that's all there is in church? And I will just say, I love leading. I love everything about the local church. I love leaders. I love pastors. And so as there's been this needed emphasis on leadership, and it's everywhere, I wanted to kind of raise the awareness about preaching and say, let's not forget our purpose here to really deliver a message, the most important message in the world.
This is the unSeminary podcast. Stuff you wish they taught in seminary.
Well, we're going to jump into the lightning round, that part of the episode where we ask similar questions of everybody that's on the show. Super excited to have Lane Sebring with us today from Preaching Donkey. It's been a great conversation, super helpful. Lane, what's an online resource that you're using these days that are helping you out in your ministry?
Okay, so Logos Bible Software. I'm not sure if that's really an online or a local resource, but it's outstanding. It's really the best. If you don't use it especially as a preacher, it's fantastic. Of course, Evernote to store things. Feedly is a way to get news, and I scan through that every night. Pocket to store those things. Of course, my podcast app. I'm a huge podcast junkie. I listen to podcasts all the time, and recently I actually got an app called Overdrive. I don't know if many people have ever heard of this, but Overdrive connects with your local public library, and you can check out ebooks and audiobooks for free. And so there's so many books that I want to read that I don't want to buy.
Yes,
and so,
exactly.
And so that has been, I can listen to a book in 2 times the speed. And so I've just been tearing through classic books, and that's kind of a non sequitur, but reading is a huge part of my life, and I love it. So cool. Those are kind of some of the things that I've been using.
Yeah, Overdrive's amazing. I'm like, we use it, and I'm like, I'm not sure how this is even possible, but I'll take it.
Yeah, it seems like it shouldn't be allowed.
Yeah, it seems like it should be illegal. So I can just listen to these. I don't have to pay for them, great. It's amazing. Yeah. What's a book you've read in the last 6 months, speaking of books, that's had an influence on your thinking and ministry?
Okay, so I want to grab it because I bought several of them for my team.
Yeah, that's great.
This is a book called Leading Change Without Losing It by Carey Nieuwhof. He's a thought leader in church leadership, and really simple book. He's written a newer one recently called something. I can't remember what it is, but this Leading Change Without Losing It, fantastic, really short read, walks you through a process of how to lead change in your church and do it and survive it and really walk people through it.
Yeah, fantastic. Carey's a great leader. Deeply respect him. He was on the episode actually way back when that came out. And, I said to him at the time, because he was writing some family stuff. He's written another book on family. And at that point I said, listen, and he was kind of pushing that family stuff more. I said, I think this Leading It Without Change Without Losing It is much better. And he's really kind of shifted his whole brand really in that direction. It's a great book. You can also go back. We'll put a link in the show notes to the interview with Carey where he talks about it, because it's a great read for sure. What's another ministry you're looking at that's inspiring you these days?
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but so many churches I love. But my favorite is Life Church, the Life Church, life.church, out of Oklahoma City, Craig Rochelle. Yep. I have been so inspired. I actually went to Life Church for about 5 years when I was in high school, high school and part of college from about 2001 to 2006. And back when I started going there, they only had like 10,000 people and 2 campuses. And by the time I left, they had like 15 campuses and 20,000. And now they've got 25 campuses and 100,000 people. And they do nothing but kill it consistently. Right. They just murder it, and they're so good at it, and they're humble about it. So I love everything that comes out of there, and big fan.
Very cool. If you could get 15 minutes with any leader alive, who would you want to get that with, and why?
Okay, so I feel like this is such a lame answer because a lot of your people are talking about like they're going to meet with, Vladimir Putin, one guy said, and all this. Yeah. Honestly, I mean, if I had just a little bit of time, it would have to be Craig Rochelle.
Right.
Because his leadership podcast, all these different things, I just want to get inside his head and learn all I can about how he leads.
Right. That's great. Good. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I was super excited to have you here today. I'm sure, keeping Preaching Donkey going and your day job and all that. What do you do when you just want to kick back and have some fun, relax a little bit?
Yeah, so I love hanging out with my wife and my 2 girls. We've got my wife, Rachel. We've got 2 little girls, one that's about 2 years old, almost 2, and one that's about 2 months old. And so nice. We're rocking the
You're
new
standing up today. That's incredible.
Yeah, standing up and surviving. And so love that. I mean, anything with them is worth doing. I actually love to work out in the yard. A lot of work we do in church never finishes. It's never complete. I can go outside and work in the yard, and there's an end to that. And I can look at it and say, look what I did. True. I accomplished something.
I cut the grass, and it's still cut.
Right, exactly. It was long, and now it's short. I did something. I love to read and write. I've got about 5 unfinished, kind of half-written books that are sitting around in some document.
Yes.
And so I love to do that. I love to travel anywhere warm. My wife and I, we love the beach. We love the Caribbean islands. Nice. So, and then Netflix. I mean, we love to veg out and watch TV and catch up on shows and stuff.
Good. Well, I want to encourage everybody to make sure they check out Preaching Donkey. Make sure they pick up a copy of your book. It's out now. If people, I'm assuming you can get that on Amazon. We'll have a link to it on our show notes. Where else, if they want to get in touch with you, can they do that?
Yeah, so the book, available Amazon Kindle version and paperback, depending on which one you want. You can get a hold of me at lane@preachingdonkey.com. So if you just email me there, you can talk to me, or of course at preachingdonkey or preachingdonkey.com. You can contact us.
Nice. Thanks so much. Appreciate you being on the show today, Lane.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's unSeminary podcast. Don't be shy. We'd love to connect. Check out unSeminary Inbox. You can sign up at unSeminary.com, and we'll send you helpful training resources every week. Plus, you'll gain immediate access to our exclusive members area with tons of resources you can use. Connect with Rich on Twitter at Rich Birch or through email, rich@unseminary.com. Don't forget to check out the show notes for this episode at unseminary.com. It includes links to what we talked about today and more. Leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Did you enjoy today's episode? Drop by iTunes and leave a review. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's unSeminary podcast. Join us next week when we'll learn more stuff we wish they taught in seminary.